You're now listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.
Hello, Colorado. This is the Engage the Rockies podcast. I am your host, Jarvis Caldwell. So over the last few weeks, we've been talking about different ballot initiatives that we're going to see this November on our election ballots. And this episode, we're going to focus on the law and order ballot initiatives is what we're calling this. And so who better else than a district attorney who lives and breathes this stuff every single day to come on and give his opinion about how he feels about some of these law and order ballot initiatives. And so our guest today is Michael J. Allen. Michael J. Allen was sworn in as the elected district attorney for Colorado's 4th Judicial District on January 12th, 2021. A Colorado native, Michael chose to serve his country after graduating from Arvada West High School. He enlisted in the Navy, we'll forgive him for that, and served as an aviation electronics technician until he was honorably discharged in 1998. In the years following his military service, Michael earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Northern Colorado, his law degree from the University of Kansas. We'll also forgive him for that as well. And then just an interesting stat that I pulled, DA Allen, is as of yesterday, the 4th Judicial District Attorney's Office has filed 16,960 cases since January 1st of 2024. And when I saw that number on your website, I was kind of blown away. That's 17,000 cases just this year alone, and we still have several months to go. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys are the busiest DA's office in the state of Colorado.
We are by far the busiest DA's office in the state of Colorado, both in filings typically and in trial work, service to victims, all those things. Yep. Excellent.
Well, we appreciate you, sir, and thank you so much for taking the time. I know with 17,000 cases, this early in the year, that's you guys are very busy, so we appreciate your time. So let's jump right into these ballot initiatives. And the first one we have 3 of them total that what I would consider law and order ballot initiatives. Yeah. And the first one we'll talk about, we'll go in order here, and it's Amendment I. So Amendment I is titled the Constitutional Bail Exemption for First Degree Murder. And this is a constitutional amendment. So for our viewers, it requires 55% approval because it's amending the Constitution. And the question is, shall there be an amendment to the Colorado Constitution concerning creating an exception to the right to bail for cases of murder in the first degree when proof is evident or presumption is great? Okay, if the first thing that you could clarify for myself and for the listeners, this specifically says a right to bail for cases of murder in the first degree. Can you kind of give us a little background on why it specifies first degree murder and how that makes it different?
Yep. Yeah, just real quickly before I jump into that, I want to thank you, Jarvis, for taking some time to chat with me about these issues today. It's I think the work that you all are doing to get the word out on different issues is really important. I appreciate the effort. And I also appreciate your prior military service as well, even if it was in the Air Force.
Well, yeah, thank you. Hey, we're both avionics guys, so
That's right. Right.
So hey.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So, anyway, thank you for that. Yeah. First degree murder.
Yeah. So the reason why this amendment is on the ballot is really because the DAs across the state of Colorado saw a glaring need to correct an issue that was created when Governor Polis signed a bill in 2020 that abolished the death penalty. So according to Colorado law, when the death penalty existed, if somebody committed first-degree murder and the proof was evident and the presumption was great that they had committed that murder, then the judge could decide to hold that person without bail pending trial. So they would not have any chance to get out of custody while the trial is pending.
Right.
And there's some keywords in there. That proof is evident, presumption is great. Those are important aspects that we need to talk about too. So anytime we have a felony case where somebody is in all likelihood going to spend time in prison, no matter how long, the person, and I'm speaking in very general terms here, but generally the person is entitled to a preliminary hearing. At a preliminary hearing, they are, they being the prosecutors are required to prove probable cause that we've got the right person, that a crime was committed, and that they probably did it. Right. Well, the proof is evident, presumption is great standard is actually higher than that. So it means you've got to put on more evidence at a preliminary hearing. So when Governor Polis, instead of allowing the death penalty to go to a vote of the Colorado citizens, he signed the bill and removed the death penalty from the possible sentences in the state of Colorado. That really had ramifications beyond just getting rid of the death penalty. Colorado statute at the time said that for capital offenses, you could hold people without bail under those circumstances I just described. Mm-hmm. Well, when he got rid of the death penalty, it also affected the ability of courts, prosecutors to have this finding made that somebody is, the presumption is great, proof is evident, presumption is great that they committed a first-degree murder case. So this actually will correct a crack that was created with that abolishing of the death penalty. So this will just allow us to go back to the way that the law existed prior to the death penalty being abolished, except we obviously don't have the death penalty today. Mm-hmm. So it will just allow us to keep the worst of the worst offenders in custody without bail pending trial. So it's important to think about what are those types of cases. Well, we've had Club Q shooting down here where 5 people were killed in a very violent attack. That's one of those types of cases. The King Super shooting up in Boulder that just went to trial and sentencing in the last couple of weeks. That is also one of those types of cases. The Aurora Theater shooting case, another example of one of these really extreme cases, first-degree murder, where you want to keep somebody that is hyper dangerous. These are not just regular killers. These are people that are wanting to commit mass murder, right?
Right.
This will allow us to hold those folks that are very dangerous in custody while we're waiting trial. It's a safety measure, it's a justice measure, and it's something that I'm very passionate about, something that the other DAs across the state are also passionate about. And so we're hoping to get this thing passed to correct what happened in 2020 with abolition of the death penalty.
So if I understand correctly, like if let's say like the Club Q shooter, they commit this horrific shooting right now, are they, without this passing yet, as it currently stands, are they technically entitled to some form of bail, even if it's set, like say it's set at $10 million or something, and there's no way that they would probably be able to afford it, but they are technically entitled to bail. And so if this passes, you guys are you basically now have the option to request that there's just no bail at all.
Exactly. Okay. That's exactly it, Jarvis. Basically the procedures on that is when we file a case involving first-degree murder, if this passes, we would tell the judge when we're setting preliminary hearing, hey, we want both a preliminary hearing and a proof evident presumption great hearing, which means that we're putting on more evidence than we would at just a regular preliminary hearing to satisfy the judge's burden of proof that we have to prove to hold somebody without bail. So there's safety measures in place there. So we're not just doing this to any old defendant. These are for the worst of the worst offenders.
Right, exactly. And first degree murder. So first degree murder, if I understand correctly, it's premeditated, right? It's the highest form of murder is odd as that might sound.
With intent. It's class 1 felony. Sentencing on those is mandatory life in prison without parole. So these are the worst of the worst cases.
Gotcha. Okay. And so I imagine, so you and other DAs are very much in support of this.
Yes. Yeah. And actually it's bipartisan too, I should say.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. We had both Democrats and Republican DAs supporting this in the legislature. To get this on the ballot, we had to run a legislative initiative. Right. And we had bipartisan support in both the House of Representatives and the Senate for Colorado legislature. And then obviously it had to be signed so that it could appear on the ballot. So we've got wide support on this. It makes a ton of sense. In fact, this is a rarity. Even the defense bar was supportive of this issue, getting on the ballot. So this is a wide-ranging, very supported issue. It should pass. I hope it passes. It would be good for public safety in Colorado.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially at a time right now when we know crime is on the rise in certain areas and certain categories. So I think there's a lot of bipartisan support. And just for a refresher for our audience, we've discussed this before on the podcast, but one of the ways that so people know that this went through the legislature as opposed to a citizen-led is because it's a letter. So it's Amendment I. unlike the next one that we're going to move to, which is Proposition 128. When you
Right.
see the number, then you know it's citizen-led. So Proposition 128, this is titled Concerning Eligibility for Parole, and this proposes a statutory change. This is also known, what I think the sponsors are calling it, the supporters called Truth in Sentencing.
Yes.
And so I'll go ahead and read this. It's a little long, so bear with me. Shall there be a change to the Colorado revised statutes concerning parole eligibility for an offender convicted of certain crimes and in connection therewith requiring an offender who is convicted of second-degree murder, first-degree assault, class 2 felony kidnapping, sexual assault, first-degree arson, first-degree burglary, or aggravated robbery committed on or after Jan 1st, 2025 to serve 85% of the sentence imposed before being eligible for parole, and requiring an offender convicted of any such crime committed on or after Jan 1st, 2025, who was previously convicted of any 2 crimes of violence, not just those crimes enumerated in this measure, to serve the full sentence imposed before beginning to serve parole. Okay, that was a lot of words there. If I understand correctly, basically saying that if you commit one of those categories of crime, then you will basically be required to serve 85% before being eligible. Now, if you've previously been convicted of 2 other violent crimes, then you have to serve the entire amount before parole. So I hope I summarized that correctly.
You're
Please.
pretty close. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. A little less legal jargon and technicality,
Yeah.
but yeah. So can you kind of give us background on this and let us know where you stand on it?
Yeah. So if we compare this to what we just talked about with Amendment I, that would be, the worst cases. What we're talking about here with Prop 128 is the next tier down. So these are really bad cases, but not the worst of the worst type of cases. So murder in the second degree, that's not a life in prison without parole sentence. That's mandatory. It is mandatory prison. So these are very specific crimes that are really horrific cases, but are not the worst of the worst. And currently in Colorado, if you get a murder in the second degree conviction, the sentencing would be between 16 and 48 years. So let's assume that somebody gets a sentence of 16 years. Automatically by state statute, it's a 75% crime. So that means you're going to serve only 75% of that. But on top of that 75% benefit, you also get earned time and good time. So that actually knocks it down to closer to 50%, 48, 50%, something like that.
Yeah.
So in reality in Colorado, as it stands today, if you get a 16-year sentence on murder in the second degree, you could be eligible for parole in as little as 8 years. And that's just not justice. It's not, that doesn't put victims in a position that they feel like their crime has been properly recognized through sentencing. There's a safety aspect of this as well, that people are getting really low sentences, actual time served in prison before they're being released out into custody.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that they're getting out so quick that they're not being rehabilitated in an effective way. And they're coming out and they're committing new offenses. We've had those types of cases here in El Paso County where somebody was sentenced to a multi-decade sentence, 20-something years. They got out in 8 years, and then they committed a messed up violent homicide case within a couple of weeks of getting out of custody. So this is just not justice. It's not reflective of the seriousness of the crime. Right. This Prop 128 would correct that issue. It's something that we've been clamoring for a long time, having some truth in sentencing, giving victims certainty, knowing that their offender is going to be in prison for longer than just a couple of, winks of an eye or something like that.
Right.
So for these types of offenses, they would not be eligible for parole at all until they get 85% of their sentence served.
Yeah, so we had on Michael Fields very early on. He was one of our first episodes, actually, and they were still collecting signatures for this. And an important point that we had discussed was, I think the statistic at the time, and I imagine it's probably not far off, was on average, people in prison are only doing 43% of their sentence. But then if you look at the recidivism rate was very high. And so basically the way that I was looking at it at the time and still do is if you're only doing 43% of your time, and then you commit a crime and you're within that window because recidivism rate's very high, you commit a crime, you should have still been in jail at that time or
That's right.
prison. And then you're committing a crime. So now you're adding victims, right,
Yeah.
to your list when you should have been sitting in jail in the first place.
Yeah.
And so that was an important point that I believe Michael had brought up
That's
at the time there.
that's
Yeah.
absolutely true. In fact, when this thing was being written, I had conversations with Christy Burton Brown, who was also involved with Michael in writing this one. Really important aspect is what you just talked about. These new victims of these offenders should not have been victimized because the offenders should have still been serving time in prison, and they're not.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's another aspect of it. And that's why I say this is a public safety measure, is that, if we keep these high-risk offenders, people that are showing a willingness to actually hurt people in prison longer, we're going to reduce the number of victims that are out in the community.
Absolutely. And we see so many cases of this. I mean, just think back, like how many times do you see some horrific crime being committed, whether it's in Colorado or New York or somewhere else, it's a high profile crime. And then they go through the laundry list of their rap sheet, and you're going, wait, they just got arrested, a few months ago for this horrific crime. And what are they doing out on the streets right now? Like that if you were the victim of the family, and you look and you go, this person was just arrested, last year for this horrific crime. Like, what were they doing out? I think it just, as a family member, if you yourself were a victim of that, you'd have a lot of questions and frankly be pissed off.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, sir. Let's see. Let's move on to the last one here. So Proposition 130. Proposition 130 is funding for law enforcement. And this is a statutory change. And the language is, shall there be a change to the Colorado Revised Statutes concerning state funding for peace officer training and support, and in connection therewith, directing the legislature to appropriate $350 million to the Peace Officer Training and Support Fund for municipal and county law enforcement agencies to hire and retain peace officers, allowing the fund to be used for pay, bonuses, initial and continuing education and training, and a death benefit for a peace officer, police, fire, and first responder killed in the line of duty, and requiring the funding to supplement existing appropriations. Okay, said a lot of words there. Basically, this is a one-time appropriation of $350 million. And then it's going to support our law enforcement. So if you can kind of let me know where you stand on that, maybe where other DAs that you've talked to and law enforcement in general stand on that.
Yeah. So I'm also supportive of this one. I'm hoping that this one passes. Same for Proposition 128. Same for Amendment I. This is a pro-public safety measure. It's also a citizen-led initiative, right? So when we're talking about numbers, they had to get enough signatures from actual Colorado citizens to get this on the ballot, and good work on them to do that. So, after we've had the issues that we've had since COVID and all the rioting in 2020 and all that kind of stuff, law enforcement has really been sort of on its back heels. This would correct a lot of those issues, give them better money for training statewide. And also, I don't know if you read this part in there or not, but it would also provide funding to family members of law enforcement who are killed on the job. So when we're talking about, we've had plenty of law enforcement officers killed down here in El Paso County on the job, across the state. And these are folks that, similar to our military, are actually swearing to go run to the sound of battle, basically, right? They're running into danger. They're running into the sound of gunfire, putting their own lives on the line for the safety of all of us. And too often, some of these folks have been killed in the line of duty, and then the family members are sort of left to fend for themselves. This would give some funding to that as well. It seems to me like a very common sense effort. And, the other thing is, the state of Colorado has spent some money on some really silly things over the last several years. We had natural migration of wolves from north in Wyoming into Colorado. And then we spent millions of dollars to bring more wolves into the state and get, sort of what I've been calling tax subsidized wolf packs. And it just seems like a silly expenditure when there's actually real world issues that we can actually put some of this money towards. And this one is a real world issue. It affects our friends and neighbors. the people that serve us every single day to protect our safety. And it just seems like it makes a ton of sense to me. So I'm also hoping that Prop 130 passes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of all the things, like you said, that we can spend money on, when you think of government, it just,
Yeah.
there's kind of three things that always come to my mind, and it's one of them is safety, right?
Yeah.
And then that's our law enforcement, and then education, infrastructure. Like, these are just kind of basic fundamental things that if we are going to be spending taxpayer money, it seems like it makes sense to spend on these things. And like you said, our law enforcement basically, they have a very thankless job sometimes.
Yeah.
And I know you had mentioned in the beginning here, we're both military guys, and whenever I'm talking with a law enforcement officer and they thank me for my service, I always go, well, I appreciate it, but thank you, because my job can be very dangerous when I was in the military, but usually for the most part, it was when you're deploying or something. So it was kind of a select window where it got very dangerous. But with our law enforcement and our firefighters and first responders, I mean, any given day, it can be extremely dangerous, right? Every time they go
Absolutely.
out. And
Yep.
so, I this seems like a very reasonable proposition here. Okay, sir, I want to respect your time. Real quick before I let you go, I wanted to ask you about juvenile crimes.
Yeah.
I feel like it's something that's not talked about enough, maybe in local media. And I'm not knocking local media, but just maybe, maybe they're not picking up on some of the stories. But can you kind of give us what you're seeing at the district level on maybe a rise, whether it is rising or not, for juvenile crimes in the area?
Yeah. So it should, what you're picking up on is exactly true, Jarvis, that juvenile crime is on the rise, especially violent juvenile crime. We're seeing more juveniles. So these are people under the age of 18 committing violent offenses than we've seen since I've been a prosecutor, and I've been in prosecution now for 20 years. So talking about a long track record, and this is the worst I've seen with juvenile crime, especially that violent juvenile crime.
Wow.
And there's a lot of aspects to this. The Juvenile Offender Code is designed to rehabilitate kids. It's not designed to be punitive like the Adult Criminal Code is designed. So when we're talking about kids committing offenses in the old days, we were talking about kids doing just dumb kid things, right?
Right.
Stealing something from the store, or getting into a fight, or causing property damage, whatever, those kinds of things. While they're serious, it's not something that you want to handicap a kid's future over. This violent crime that we're starting to see now, where kids are getting a hold of firearms when they're not legally able to even possess them.
Right.
And then the manner in which they're getting a hold of these firearms. We've seen a rash of smash and grabs over the last several months. In fact, in this year alone, we've seen over 30. I think we're up to 35-ish roughly in the county.
Wow.
Whereas in all of last year, 2023, we had a minuscule number. I think it was 7 total. So huge increase in these things. And what they're stealing in some instances, actually several instances, is firearms. So they'll smash into a firearms store, and then they'll go in and just steal, 20, 30 firearms. And then we know those firearms are not being taken to a bake sale to raise money for some charity, right? They're being taken to commit other violent offenses, whether it's drive-by shootings, aggravated robberies, whatever it might be, murders, attempted murders, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And this is really an outgrowth of several issues. One, there's been an effort from the legislature to sort of handcuff law enforcement and prosecutors and courts, frankly, as to how they can deal with juvenile crime, sort of lessening the punishments. There will be an effort probably this coming legislative session to raise the floor, they call it, so that only kids 13 and up can be prosecuted for offenses. Whereas currently we can prosecute kids from 10 and up to 18 for any offenses. And we're seeing 11, 12-year-old kids doing these smash and grabs. We're seeing 11, 12-year-old kids doing drive-by shootings. We're seeing 11 and 12-year-old kids doing motor vehicle theft. So the idea that we would raise the floor to protect kids sounds great, and it's hard to argue against, because it sounds like you're just protecting kids who are getting caught up in a system. But the reality is that some of these kids are actually doing some really bad things, and this will actually be detrimental on public safety. So you got to think about that going into 2025. And then separately, the bed cap issue. So when we talked about Amendment I, we're talking about, when somebody has been charged with an offense and then they're awaiting trial, they have to stay in jail, right?
Right.
So this is a similar issue, but it's for juveniles. So currently for the state of Colorado, we have 217 total beds that are allocated out to the state of Colorado. And in the Pikes Peak region, we had 27 total beds. If you go back to before COVID, we had 380 beds for the whole state, and then that was allocated out. So we had many more beds available to us here in the Pikes Peak region to hold some of these violent juvenile offenders in custody while they're waiting trial. Now what happens is we're almost always at bed cap capacity. So anytime a kid commits a new violent offense, that kid goes into custody. And then that means some other kid that was in custody on some violent offense has to pop out the other side and go back out into the home life that they were in when they committed the offense to begin with. So it's creating this revolving door juvenile justice system here in Colorado. It needs to be fixed. There's going to be an effort to fix that this coming legislative session too, to increase that bed cap number. And It's important to note that 217 number that I'm talking about that's allocated to the entire state, totally arbitrary number. There was no study that said, hey, this is all the bed space we need. This will be more than enough. It'll help us curtail juvenile crime. It was just totally picked out of the blue and is handicapping the ability to hold some of these kids accountable for violent offenses. So that'll be something that I'll be fighting for up in the legislature this coming session. I get up and testify in front of different committees all the time, every legislative session. That's one that I'm really passionate about and will be fighting for. And hopefully we'll get that one through, and hopefully Governor Polis will sign it when we get it through the legislature. But it's going to be a tough fight.
Yeah, no kidding. So when I was a staff member up there at the Capitol in 2023, I remember there was a bill, and from my understanding, I think it was bipartisan, and I can't recall off the top of my head if it passed or not, but there was a bill. Again, I know at least one Republican was on it, but the idea of it was to, I guess, not criminally charge, I think 10 to 12-year-olds or 10 to 13-year-olds. And I'm sure you probably know the bill that I'm talking about, but I don't recall if it passed, but I remember it did not. Okay. No. I remember there was big concern, and you even testified on this, but that the gangs are recruiting people. When I say people, I mean kids, recruiting kids. Like if you say that you can't charge a 10 to 13-year-old, well, guess what? The gangs are going to go out there and start recruiting a bunch of 11, 12, 13-year-olds to go commit horrible crimes because they can't be charged. And so if they get caught, they just get released. And it sounds like what you're saying is it's going to come back.
Yeah, it's coming back. It'll be another effort this time. It didn't make it through last time. And it has an emotional appeal, right? If you say, hey, a 10, 11-year-old, 12-year-old kid, we shouldn't be prosecuting them and putting them into juvenile detention. Well, the fact of the matter is that's true for most 10 to 12-year-olds, right?
Right. Yeah.
But when we're talking about completely removing 11 and 12-year-old kids from the juvenile justice code, just because of their age, when we know that they're committing motor vehicle theft. I saw a video just the other day that CSPD showed me of an 11-year-old kid in broad daylight going up and attempting to steal a car from a lady. And then when he's not successful, he breaks the windows in the vehicle and drives off in a different stolen car. And, so we're seeing violent interactions with the community from 11 and 12-year-old kids that is not reflective of this idea that we shouldn't be charging 11 and 12-year-old kids with the offenses that they're committing. It's going to be something we're all going to have to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's incredible. My oldest son, just before we started recording this podcast, I just went and put my kids on the bus for elementary school, and my oldest son's turning 11 in like 2 weeks, and I'm just thinking, I'm like, I can't even imagine him driving in a stolen car or doing a drive-by shooting or something. It's just, I mean, it kind of makes me tear up just even thinking about that. That's a reality for some kids and some families. Okay. We went way over time, sir. I really appreciate it. I know the audience really appreciates it. I kind of teased this a few times with audience members that we're going to have you on and do this. And so I think people are really looking forward to it. So, I hope they learned something from this. I always have to put out the disclaimer. Engage the Rockies. We're a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit, so we don't take any official positions on these amendments, but we want to bring them people who can give them their opinions on it. So we really appreciate you coming on, and maybe hopefully have you back on after all this, or maybe during next session when there's some important law and order type legislation on, and have you come talk about it.
Absolutely, Jarvis. Yeah, I really appreciate it. I think you're doing really good work with this podcast, getting information out to the people in a way that makes sense. Having these types of conversations, it's really valuable. I don't think we get enough of this, actually. And
Yes,
I think
sir.
it leads to people not knowing what's happening with laws and legislation that's working through the legislative session. So I'm more than happy to do it again. I appreciate the work you're all doing.
Excellent, sir. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.